Alistair sat in the dim light of his study, surrounded by old tomes and scrolls that he had long ago grown tired of deciphering. The air was thick with the scent of aged parchment and the crackling sound of the fire in the hearth. He had lived alone for years, a recluse in a quiet corner of the kingdom, hiding away from the conflicts that seemed to never cease between humans and the beast folk. His studies had once filled him with excitement, magical research, forgotten spells, and lost histories. But now, those same pursuits felt like a distant memory. Alistair had made his peace with isolation, or so he thought. That was until the knock came. It was soft at first, a faint tapping against the wooden door. Alistair frowned, glancing up from his work. He hadn't expected anyone, certainly not at this hour. He hesitated, setting aside the quill and standing. The last time someone had come calling, it had been a soldier bringing news of some distant skirmish or another. But this was different. The knocking persisted, growing more insistent. Reluctantly, Alistair moved toward the door, his hand pausing just before the handle. He had heard whispers of the beast folk, how their numbers were dwindling, how their fertility had become a curse that only worsened with time. The rumors had been impossible to ignore, but Alistair had not been part of their world for years. He'd stayed far away from their desperate pleas for help, their political struggles, and their inevitable decline. The knocking continued. With a resigned sigh, Alistair opened the door. Standing in the moonlight was a woman, or rather a beast woman. She had the body of a tall, muscular woman, but her features were unmistakably that of a lioness. Tawny fur covering her face and arms, sharp amber eyes glowing in the darkness, and a regal, almost predatory bearing. Her long, dark hair framed her face, and she wore a simple tunic that clung to her form. Behind her stood a group of similar figures, each more intimidating than the last. Alistair stiffened. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice betraying no hint of fear, though his pulse quickened. The lioness stared at him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "We need your help," she said, her voice low and commanding, yet tinged with desperation. "You're the only one who can help us." Alistair's mind raced, but he found himself unable to form the words. I'm not involved in whatever this is. I don't want any part of it," he stammered, trying to step back. His hand reached for the door, but she moved faster, blocking his path. "Don't try to run," she said, her tone now soft but no less determined. "You have knowledge we need. You know what is happening to us." Alistair's brow furrowed. "What's happening to you?" She glanced over her shoulder at the others. The beast women behind her exchanged looks, but the lioness kept her gaze fixed firmly on him. "Our kind is dying," she said, a pained expression flickering across her face. "Infertility. We can no longer reproduce. We need a way to survive." Alistair's mind clicked into place. He had heard of the beast folk's plight, how their population had begun to dwindle after a mysterious curse had rendered their females infertile. It was a tragedy that was whispered about in the corners of human towns, but he hadn't known the extent of it until now. "Why come to me?" Alistair asked, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm just a scholar. I don't." "We know what you've studied," the lioness interrupted, her voice sharp now. "Magic, biology, the ancient rituals that were once used to bridge our kinds. You've studied them, haven't you? You know the truth." The words hung heavy in the air. Alistair had indeed studied such things. He had delved into the obscure magics of old, researched the creatures who once roamed the earth, both human and beast. But he had always kept his distance from such topics, refusing to be involved. He knew the risks of crossing such boundaries. He knew the consequences, but he hadn't realized how desperate they had become. These beast women had turned to him, the last person in the world he would have imagined. And now they were here demanding his help. "What do you want me to do?" Alistair asked, his voice heavy with reluctance. "We need you to help us restore our kind," the lioness replied. Her amber eyes softened for a moment. "We believe the answer lies in you." Alistair frowned, unsure of what she meant. Before he could ask further, the lioness stepped closer, her presence overwhelming. "We don't just need your knowledge," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper now. "We need something more. We need you to help us breed." Alistair's heart skipped a beat, the shock of her words freezing him in place. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came. The implication of her statement, the weight of what she was asking, crushed him. She wasn't speaking of a simple ritual or an exchange of knowledge. She was asking for something far more personal, something intimate. "You." He couldn't find the words to finish the sentence. His mind spun with confusion, disgust, and a growing sense of fear. "I know it's difficult to understand," the lioness said, her voice gentler now, "but you must realize our survival depends on this. Without your help, we are doomed." Alistair swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had always stayed out of the beast folk's world, avoiding their politics, their struggles. But now there was no turning back. He could see the desperation in her eyes. These women had nothing left to lose. "You're asking me to—" He trailed off, the weight of the request sinking in. "Yes," the lioness said. "We need you." Alistair stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. The room felt smaller, the shadows longer, as the reality of the situation set in. He was trapped, bound not just by their demands but by the very need that had driven them to him in the first place. "Come with us," the lioness said, her voice commanding once more. "You have no choice." Before Alistair could respond, the beast women behind her moved forward, grabbing him by the arms. He tried to resist, but their strength was overwhelming. The door slammed shut behind him as he was pulled into the night, the cold air biting at his skin as they led him deeper into the wilderness. The silence was deafening as they walked. Alistair's mind was a blur, and his thoughts were clouded by the events unfolding around him. What had he gotten himself into? Would he be able to escape? Or had his fate already been sealed the moment they arrived at his door? As they reached the edge of the forest, the lioness turned to him, her eyes now softer, almost pleading. "Please," she whispered, "help us." Alistair's heart pounded in his chest as he stared back at her. He had never been a hero, but somehow he knew this would change everything. Alistair stumbled as the beast women marched him through the dense forest, their powerful hands gripping him tightly. The cool night air bit at his skin, and the dark shadows of the trees stretched ominously around them. The path ahead was barely visible, the moonlight filtering through the canopy in spots, casting a faint, eerie glow. His heart hammered in his chest as his mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of them offering any solace. The lioness, whose name he had yet to learn, led the group. Her steps were sure, and despite the urgency in her actions, there was a calmness in her demeanor that unsettled him. She moved with grace and strength, as though the weight of their mission was a burden she had long since accepted. The others, her companions, were more silent, but their presence was unmistakable. He could feel their eyes on him, assessing, waiting. The tension hung thick in the air. They stopped in a small clearing, the trees closing in around them. The moonlight shone down more directly now, illuminating the clearing just enough for Alistair to take in his surroundings. A crude but sturdy tent had been set up in the center, surrounded by large stone circles and ritualistic markings etched into the earth. His stomach churned at the sight. He had known that magic often required sacrifice, but the atmosphere here felt different. There was something primal in the air, something far beyond simple ritual. The lioness turned to face him, her amber eyes glowing with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "This is where you'll help us," she said, her voice low and steady, but the undercurrent of desperation was clear. Alistair swallowed, trying to steady his nerves. "I've told you already, I don't know if I can. If I should," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "What you're asking, it's too much." She stepped closer, her gaze never leaving his. "You're the only one who can do this," she said, the conviction in her voice stronger now. "There is no one else who understands the magic, the biology like you do. You know what we need. This is our last hope." Her hand, though strong, was gentle as it brushed the side of his arm. He flinched, but she didn't pull away. Alistair clenched his fists at his sides, trying to ignore the flicker of heat that had spread through his body. His mind told him to pull away, to resist, but a part of him couldn't help but be drawn to the woman standing before him. She was beautiful in a way that both disturbed and captivated him. Her feline features, her strength, and that raw, untamed power she carried with her. But it wasn't just her appearance that held him. There was something in her eyes, a quiet desperation, a hunger he couldn't quite name. He opened his mouth to protest again, but the words caught in his throat. He felt her gaze penetrate deeper, as though she could see into the very core of him. "You're afraid," she said, her voice softer now, almost soothing. "I understand, but you must realize this is the only way to save us." "To save me?" Alistair's breath hitched. The finality in her words settled deep in his chest. He knew she wasn't just speaking for herself. Her people, the beast folk, were counting on him. He had no illusions about their situation. The infertility crisis wasn't just a minor issue. It was the heart of their struggle, and it was growing worse by the day. His mind raced through the possible outcomes of what they were suggesting. If he helped, if he agreed, would he be complicit in their survival at the cost of his own morality? He shook his head, trying to clear the confusion. "I'm not a part of your world," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "I have nothing to give you. You have everything to give," she responded. Her eyes softened just a fraction as she reached out, placing a hand gently against his chest. The warmth of her touch seeped through his clothes, and for a moment, he forgot to breathe. He had never been this close to someone like her. Someone so powerful, so unyielding. Your knowledge, your body, your essence, they are all part of the solution. Alistair felt a twinge of guilt, of confusion, swirl within him. She spoke of his knowledge, his understanding of magic and biology, but there was more to it than that. It wasn't just his mind they were after. They needed something deeper, something intimate. The other beast women stood back, observing quietly, their faces unreadable. Alistair could feel their eyes on him, assessing every move. He felt exposed, vulnerable. He had no idea what would happen next, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. "I can't." His voice trailed off as he glanced back at the tent, the markings on the ground, the faint smell of incense that lingered in the air. He had spent years researching the arcane, but this was something he had never imagined. "You can," the lioness said, her voice firm once more. She took a step back, but her eyes never left his. "You have no choice now. If you leave, we will hunt you down. But if you stay, we will guide you. Together, we will ensure the future of my people." The weight of her words pressed down on him, suffocating him. He wanted to refuse, to walk away, to escape back into his quiet life of books and research. But something in the way she spoke, the way she looked at him, made it impossible to simply turn his back. Alistair took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air fill his lungs. He could not ignore what was at stake. Not for them, not for him. He had to make a choice. What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The lioness gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. It was the first sign of warmth he had seen from her since they arrived. She stepped closer, her body nearly brushing against his. He could feel the heat of her scent, a mix of earth and wildness that filled his senses. "Now," she said, "we prepare." Before Alistair could respond, she motioned for him to follow. The others moved aside, making room for him to enter the tent. His legs felt heavy as he stepped forward, and his heart beat faster with each step. He knew he was crossing a line, one that, once crossed, would be impossible to return from. Inside the tent, the atmosphere was different. The air was thick with the scent of incense, the flickering light of candles casting long shadows on the walls. At the center, a large stone slab was placed, surrounded by more intricate markings. The ritual had already begun, even before he'd arrived. Alistair's mind raced. Was this really the only way? Was this what he had been destined for all along? The lioness turned to him as he stood at the entrance, her eyes steady and calm. "This is our last chance, Alistair. Don't turn away from it now." With a deep, resigned breath, Alistair stepped into the tent, feeling the weight of the choice ahead of him settle like a stone in his stomach. The moment of decision had arrived. The air inside the tent was thick with the smell of burning herbs and incense, the flickering candlelight casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. Alistair stepped further into the space, his heart pounding in his chest. The lioness, he still didn't know her name, stood near the center, her amber eyes fixed on him, full of quiet anticipation. The stone slab in the middle of the room loomed large, its surface etched with intricate markings that seemed to shimmer in the candlelight. Around the slab, several beast women gathered, their eyes trained on Alistair. Each one wore an expression that was a mix of curiosity and urgency. The tension in the air was palpable, and Alistair's mind struggled to keep pace with the gravity of what was unfolding. The lioness spoke, her voice low and commanding. "You've crossed the threshold, Alistair. There's no turning back now." Her words hit him like a cold gust of wind, and he felt a chill run down his spine. But despite the fear that gnawed at him, there was something else. A deep, unspoken pull toward her and the others. The desperation in their eyes mirrored his own hidden uncertainties. He had always prided himself on his intellect, on being a man of reason, but standing in front of these powerful, sensual creatures, logic seemed to fall away. "Why me?" he asked, his voice rough. "Why not someone else? There must be other men. I'm not the person you need." The lioness took a step forward, closing the distance between them. Her presence was overwhelming, and Alistair found himself instinctively backing up, but her eyes held him in place. "You are the one we've chosen," she said softly. "You have the knowledge, the strength, and the spark of humanity that we need. You're different from the others." He swallowed hard, trying to force some sense of clarity back into his mind. But the closer she got, the harder it became to think. There was something intoxicating about her presence, something magnetic. He could feel the heat radiating off her, a wildness that seemed to hum in the air between them. She wasn't just speaking of knowledge anymore, he realized. She was speaking of something else. "Please," she whispered, reaching out and gently taking his hand. Her fingers were warm, calloused, yet tender. "We need you. I need you." Alistair opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. His hand trembled slightly as she held it, and he could feel the soft pulse of her skin against his. She didn't look at him with pity. It wasn't sympathy. It was something far more primal, a hunger that flickered beneath the surface of her calm demeanor. The other beast women were silent, observing, their eyes full of expectation. The lioness stepped back, her gaze never leaving him. "If you choose to help us," she continued, "you must understand that it is not a simple act. This is about the future of my people. This is about survival." Alistair's mind whirled. The weight of the decision was unbearable. He had never imagined he would be caught in a situation like this. The thought of their world, their survival, depended on him was overwhelming. Yet there was a part of him, a part that he had never known to exist, that was drawn to them, the lioness especially. He couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize it. It was as if some ancient, forgotten part of him recognized the urgency in their plea. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can do this." She tilted her head, her eyes searching his. "You can," she said firmly. "We'll guide you. You don't have to be afraid." Alistair's breath caught in his throat as she stepped even closer, her body so near that he could feel the heat of her presence. The air between them seemed to hum, charged with a palpable tension. For a moment, time seemed to slow. He could hear the faint rustle of the other beast women, their movements deliberate but quiet, as though waiting for something to unfold. The lioness reached up, her fingers brushing lightly against his jaw. Her touch was electric, sending a jolt of warmth through his skin, and he couldn't help but lean into it slightly, his body betraying his logical mind. "We don't need to rush this," she said. her voice a soft purr that seemed to vibrate through his chest. But you need to understand what's at stake. Alistair nodded, but his thoughts were clouded. The sensation of her hand on him, the way she touched him so confidently, was both intoxicating and terrifying. Her presence seemed to pull him deeper into a space he didn't understand, and the more he tried to resist, the harder it became to fight. He could feel the weight of their gazes on him, urging him to make a decision, but the confusion in his mind held him still. I can't, he murmured, his words faltering. I can't just give myself to you. This isn't right. The lioness's eyes softened, and she gently cupped his cheek with her other hand. It's not about what's right or wrong, Alistair, she said, her voice soothing, almost hypnotic. It's about survival, about ensuring that our people live on. And you, she paused, her gaze flickering down to his chest before meeting his eyes again. You are the key to that future. Alistair closed his eyes for a moment, his head spinning. His heart raced as he tried to force some clarity, but every thought felt muddled in the face of the lioness's insistence. He felt like he was being pulled into something far greater than himself. The primal nature of their need, the raw intensity of the situation, it was too much to comprehend. I can't, he whispered again, though there was doubt in his voice now. Was he truly saying no? Or was he just afraid of what was being asked of him? The lioness's fingers gently traced the line of his jaw, and her thumb brushed his lower lip. The soft touch made his breath hitch. You don't have to be afraid, she repeated, her voice like velvet. We'll help you. All you need to do is trust us. The others gathered closer, the air around them thick with anticipation. Alistair's pulse raced. His body, despite his mind's protests, was responding to the closeness, the heat of the moment. His breath came in shallow gasps as the lioness leaned in, her lips almost brushing against his ear. Let us help you, she whispered. Alistair's mind screamed at him to pull away, to break free, but his body remained frozen, caught in the tension, the pull of the impossible choice before him. He had crossed into their world, and now he couldn't escape. The lioness was right, he had no choice. The moment of decision was closing in. As she leaned in closer, Alistair knew that the path he was about to walk would change everything. The tension in the air thickened, palpable and undeniable, as the lioness's proximity to Alistair seemed to heighten. The flickering candlelight cast shadows across her face, making her amber eyes glow like molten gold, deep with an intensity that both unsettled and captivated him. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the soft brush of her fingers against his skin still lingering, igniting a strange, almost intoxicating warmth that spread throughout his body. For a moment, the world outside of the tent seemed to fade away. The cool night air, the distant rustle of the trees, until all that remained was the rhythmic sound of his breathing and the steady gaze of the lioness before him. Her lips parted slightly as she took a step back, her hands resting at her sides as if giving him a moment to collect himself, though the pause only served to heighten his confusion and growing desire to understand the strange, mysterious pull toward her. Do you trust us, Alistair? She asked, her voice smooth and quiet, but there was an underlying urgency in her words that could not be ignored. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Instead, his gaze darted to the other beast women, who had circled around him like silent sentinels, watching, waiting. Their presence was powerful, and Alistair felt small under their scrutinizing eyes. It wasn't just the lioness now, it was all of them, the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. I don't know, he admitted quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can do this. The lioness took a step closer once more, her movement fluid and graceful, as though every step had been carefully calculated. Her eyes never left his, unwavering in their intensity. You must, she said simply, the finality in her voice sending a shiver through his spine. We need you. You are the only one who can help us. Alistair's mind raced. This was not a situation he had ever imagined himself in, let alone wanted to be in. His life had been simple before this: research, books, the quiet hum of his studies. But now, Everything had shifted, and there was no turning back. It wasn't just about the survival of the beast folk. It was about the unspoken bond that was beginning to form between him and the lioness. She reached out once more, this time brushing her fingers against his chest, right over his heart. The soft touch sent a jolt of warmth through him, making his breath catch in his throat. He could feel the beat of his own heart, racing in his chest, mirroring the intensity of the moment. "Trust us, Alistair," she whispered, her lips dangerously close to his ear. "This is the only way. We will guide you, and together, we will make sure my people survive." Alistair clenched his fists at his sides, fighting the urge to step away from her. He had never felt so conflicted, so caught between what was right and what was being asked of him. His eyes flicked to the stone slab in the center of the room, its markings still shimmering in the candlelight. The weight of what he was about to do hung heavily in the air, and he could feel the weight of it deep in his chest. "I don't understand," he whispered, his voice strained. "Why me? Why not someone else? I'm just a man." The lioness stepped back slightly, her gaze softening, but the edge of desperation still clung to her voice. "Because you are not just any man. You have knowledge that others do not possess. You understand the magic, the biology. You understand how to help us. You have something no one else does, Alistair." The words were both an explanation and a plea, and as they hung in the air between them, Alistair felt a pang of guilt and uncertainty tighten in his chest. Could he really help them? Could he truly offer himself up for something as far-reaching and complex as this? He swallowed hard, struggling to find his voice again. I don't know if I can," he said, his throat tight. "I've never done anything like this." The lioness's eyes softened, and she took another step closer, her body brushing against his as she reached up to place her hand gently on his cheek. The simple touch, so tender yet charged with an undeniable intensity, sent a wave of warmth through him. His breath hitched involuntarily, and for a moment, he found himself leaning into her, caught in the pull of her presence. "You don't have to know everything," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "Just trust us. Trust me." Alistair's thoughts seemed to slow, the noise in his mind quieting as he met her gaze. It wasn't just her words. It was the way she looked at him, as though she truly saw him, as though she needed him in a way that no one ever had before. The weight of her gaze settled on him, heavy and searching, and despite the fear gnawing at his insides, he couldn't bring himself to pull away. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice barely audible. The lioness smiled then, a small, knowing smile that made his heart skip a beat. "You don't have to do anything yet. Just come with us. Let us show you what needs to be done. The rest will come naturally." Alistair wanted to argue, wanted to refuse, but the words felt trapped in his throat. He felt like he was drowning in the weight of the moment, in the powerful emotions that rose within him every time she touched him, every time she spoke to him. Her voice was like a lullaby, gentle and soothing, but beneath the surface, there was something deeper, something primal. Without a word, she turned, and Alistair found himself following her. He didn't know why. He didn't know what he was doing, or why he was allowing himself to be led further into this world that had never been his. But he did, and as he walked behind her, the other beast women following close behind, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. They reached the stone slab and the air grew heavier. The lioness turned to face him, her expression serene but intense. "Are you ready to help us?" she asked, her voice steady but with a trace of something deeper, something unspoken. Alistair stood still for a moment, his thoughts swirling. He could feel the weight of their gaze, the heat of their expectations pressing down on him. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but he knew one thing. There was no going back now. I think I am," he said, his voice rough. The lioness gave a small, satisfied smile. "Then let us begin." As she stepped back, the air seemed to shift around them, thick with anticipation. Alistair's heart raced as he braced himself for what was to come next, though deep down, he knew that whatever happened now, nothing would ever be the same again. The candlelight flickered once more as the lioness stepped aside, giving Alistair a clear view of the stone slab. The deep markings on its surface seemed to pulse, glowing faintly as if alive, as though the very room was waiting for something to happen. Alistair's breath caught in his throat as he looked at the intricate patterns. Some were symbols he had seen before in ancient texts. Others were foreign and strange, written in a language he couldn't decipher. The slab is a conduit, the lioness explained, her voice low and steady. It channels the energy we need, but we require more than just the ritual. We need the right catalyst. You, Alistair glanced at her, still unsure, still uncertain of what he had gotten himself into. His mind raced, his logical side fighting against the pull of the situation. This wasn't something he had ever expected in his quiet life as a scholar. It wasn't just about knowledge or research anymore. It was about the survival of an entire race. And here, standing before him, were the beings who depended on him. You want me to? His voice faltered as he struggled to find the right words. To help us continue, the lioness finished for him, her eyes not leaving his. To give us the means to survive. You must understand that we have no choice. You are our only option. She stepped closer, her presence commanding yet gentle. There was an undeniable weight to her words, but also something else, something he couldn't quite place. A soft, almost irresistible invitation. Can I really do this? Alistair asked, his voice strained. Am I the right person for this? Her eyes softened, and she reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his cheek. The sensation sent a jolt of warmth through him, and for a moment, it felt as though the world outside the tent no longer existed. Only she and the others remained, waiting, needing, hoping. You are the only one who can, she whispered. You will help us ensure that our species survives, that we live on. Alistair's heart raced in his chest. He could feel his pulse thudding in his ears, the tension between them thick and heavy. Every instinct in his body told him to step back, to run, but every part of him also longed to stay, to find out what lay beyond the surface of this strange and captivating world. The lioness stood before him, her body close but not touching, her gaze intense, almost as if she were reading his very thoughts. I don't know if I can, he muttered, the words barely escaping his lips. I don't know how to be the answer you need. The lioness tilted her head slightly, studying him. You don't have to know everything, she said. You only have to trust. He felt the weight of her words settle around him. The idea of trust felt distant and foreign, but something about the way she said it, her voice filled with an almost hypnotic cadence, made it seem possible. The world seemed to shift around them, the flickering candlelight casting shadows that danced like ghosts on the walls, giving the room a dreamlike quality. The air between them was thick with unspoken desire. His pulse quickened, and for the first time since arriving here, Alistair found himself unsure of his next move. He wasn't a man of action. He was a man of thought, of knowledge, of reason. But all the logic in the world didn't seem to matter here. What mattered was the silent understanding between them, between him and the lioness. He could feel her need, her desperation, and it tugged at him, pulling him deeper into something he wasn't prepared for. She stepped closer, her body brushing against his. The contact was subtle, but it sent a jolt through him, a wave of heat that spread from where they touched to the very tips of his fingers. He swallowed hard, trying to steady himself, but the lioness's presence was overwhelming. She was everything he had ever read about in the stories, graceful, strong, alluring. But there was something deeper than physical beauty that held him captive. It was the urgency in her eyes, the quiet pleading that was masked by her calm demeanor. She was asking for his help, but there was also something else beneath the surface, something more intimate. Trust me, she repeated, her voice a soft plea. We need you. The future depends on you. Alistair closed his eyes for a moment, trying to clear his mind, but the soft hum of the tent, the flickering of the candles, the warmth of her breath against his skin, all of it seemed to drown out his thoughts. He could feel his body reacting to her nearness, his senses heightening. The air between them seemed to crackle with energy, the silence thick with anticipation. I don't know how this works, he said, his voice thick with uncertainty. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. The lioness smiled softly, a gentle, almost reassuring expression. She reached up and cupped his face in her hands, her touch tender and surprisingly soft. Her thumb traced the line of his jaw, sending a ripple of warmth through him. For a moment, the world around him seemed to slow, her touch grounding him in the present. You don't need to know all the answers right now, she said, her voice low and soothing. You just need to trust that we are here to guide you. Her lips were so close to his now, just a breath away. He could feel her warmth, the faint scent of her skin, the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. It was almost intoxicating, the way she stood so close. Yet there was a respect, a quiet understanding that she wasn't pushing him, just waiting. Alistair's heart raced in his chest, and he could feel the tension in his body, the pull between what he knew was logical and the deep, visceral need to respond to the moment, to the situation unfolding around him. He had crossed into their world, and now there was no going back. He had already made the decision when he had stepped through the door. This was his choice, whether he realized it or not. I'll trust you, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. The lioness's eyes brightened, a faint smile curling at the corner of her lips. Good, she whispered in return. Then let us begin. She moved back, and Alistair felt a pang of longing at the sudden distance, though he couldn't explain why. She gestured for him to follow, and he did, his feet moving almost of their own accord as he approached the stone slab. The air around them seemed to vibrate, humming with unseen energy as the lioness turned to the other women in the room. They were watching him, their expressions unreadable. Yet there was something in their eyes, something deep and primal. The lioness knelt beside the slab, motioning for him to do the same. This is the moment, she said, her voice solemn. This is where everything changes. For us, for you. Alistair hesitated for a moment, but then, something inside him stirred. He had come this far, and he wasn't sure how or why, but he knew he had to follow through. He had to do this. He knelt beside her, the stone cold beneath his knees, and waited as the others began to move around them, their presence shifting like a gentle wave. He felt the weight of their gaze once more, but now it didn't feel as heavy. It felt like something else, something that might be understood only after he had taken the next step. Are you ready? The lioness asked, her voice both soft and filled with purpose. Alistair nodded, his breath caught in his throat. I think so, he whispered, and in that moment, everything seemed to fall into place. The air in the tent grew heavier as Alistair knelt beside the stone slab. The flickering candlelight illuminated the faces of the beast women around him, their eyes filled with a mixture of anticipation and something deeper, something primal that Alistair couldn't fully comprehend, but felt in his very bones. He could feel the tension in the room, the weight of it pressing down on him, urging him to take the next step. The lioness, still kneeling beside the slab, turned to look at him, her amber eyes glowing in the dim light. Her gaze was steady, intense, as if she were waiting for something, perhaps for him to make the decision that would change everything. For a brief moment, Alistair's mind swirled with doubt. Was he truly ready for this? Could he follow through with what they all seemed to expect from him? But as the lioness reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, a strange sense of calm washed over him. Her touch was gentle, yet firm, grounding him in the moment. There was no going back now. He had already crossed the threshold by coming here, by being in this space. What mattered now was what happened next. Trust, she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of everything that had led them to this point. Trust that this is the way forward. He nodded slowly, though his throat tightened with uncertainty. His pulse thudded in his ears, each beat feeling louder than the last. He had come here seeking answers, but now, it seemed the answers lay within him. He was the key, the catalyst that would allow them to continue to survive. The idea was overwhelming, yet there was something undeniably compelling about it. The sense of purpose that it gave him, the idea that he could make a difference. The lioness's fingers lingered on his shoulder for a moment longer, before she withdrew her hand and motioned for him to focus on the slab. The intricate markings glowed faintly, pulsating in time with the rhythm of his own heart. It was as if the stone was alive, waiting for something to ignite it, to awaken the energy that lay dormant within. "This is where it begins," the lioness said, her voice low and steady. "The slab is attuned to the energy we need, but it requires the right catalyst, the right connection. Only you can provide that." Alistair glanced at her, the weight of her words sinking in. The sense of responsibility pressed down on him, but at the same time, there was a strange pull, a desire to move forward. His fingers brushed against the surface of the slab, and a jolt of energy shot through him, making his breath catch in his throat. The stone seemed to hum beneath his touch, as if it were acknowledging him, responding to his presence. The lioness watched him closely, her gaze unwavering. "You feel it, don't you?" she asked softly. Alistair nodded, his hands still resting on the stone. The energy was subtle but unmistakable. It was as if the slab itself was alive, its power resonating with his own. The sensation was both foreign and familiar, and as the minutes passed, he felt a strange sense of connection to it, as though his own energy was being drawn into the stone, merging with it. "Yes," he murmured, his voice thick with the weight of the experience. "I feel it." The lioness gave a small nod of approval. "Good. Now you must let it guide you. Allow it to open the path." Alistair wasn't sure what that meant, but he trusted her words. Slowly, he took a deep breath and closed his eyes, focusing on the sensation of the stone beneath his fingertips. The energy seemed to pulse, growing stronger with each passing second. It felt as though something was awakening inside him, something that had been dormant for a long time. It was as if the power of the stone was calling to him, urging him to step forward, to embrace whatever came next. As he focused on the energy, he became aware of the presence of the other beast women around him. He could feel their eyes on him, their attention unwavering, their expectations clear. They were waiting for him to do something, to make the next move. Alistair's pulse quickened, but he didn't move. Not yet. Instead, he allowed himself to settle into the energy, to let it wash over him. The lioness stepped closer, her gaze still fixed on him, her expression unreadable. She reached out, her hand brushing gently against his back, a touch that was both comforting and electrifying. "You are doing well," she whispered, her voice low and soothing. "Let the energy guide you." He nodded, though he wasn't sure what he was supposed to do next. He didn't fully understand the magic at work, the ancient forces that were at play, but he knew deep down that this was something that had to happen. For them, for their survival. Slowly, the lioness stepped back, and Alistair felt the energy in the room shift. The other women, once silent and still, now moved closer, their movements fluid and deliberate. They surrounded him, their presence comforting yet unsettling. Their eyes were filled with a strange mixture of reverence and something more, something that felt both tender and intense. Alistair felt the weight of their gaze, but it didn't feel like pressure. It felt like they were waiting for him to make the next choice, to take the next step. The lioness stepped forward again, her gaze locking with his. "You've already made the decision," she said softly. "Now you must allow the energy to guide you. Let it flow through you." Alistair swallowed hard, his mouth dry as he tried to steady his breath. He could feel the warmth of the other women surrounding him, the heat of their bodies pressing against his. He wasn't sure what was happening, but the tension in the air was undeniable. It wasn't just about the magic of the slab anymore. It was about something deeper, something more intimate. He glanced at the lioness, searching her face for any sign of hesitation, any clue as to what was expected of him. But her expression was calm, reassuring, as though she had been through this many times before. "Trust yourself," she whispered. And in that moment, Alistair realized that he had no choice but to trust in the energy that was flowing around him, trust in the strange connection that had formed between them. There was no more time for doubts. The path was before him, and all he had to do was walk it. He closed his eyes once more, allowing the energy to wash over him, feeling the pull of it in every part of his body. It wasn't just the slab that was alive, it was everything. The room, the women, the very air around him. It was all alive, and it was all waiting for him. As the energy grew stronger, Alistair took a deep breath, his mind finally clearing. There was no turning back now. He had already made the choice. All that was left to do was follow where the energy led him. And with that, he stepped forward. The morning light seeped through the canopy of the forest, casting streaks of gold across the ground. Alistair stirred from his light sleep, his muscles stiff from the rough bedding of leaves and a makeshift mat. He blinked up at the dappled sunlight and exhaled deeply, his mind still heavy with the events of the previous night. Around him, the camp was coming to life. Low voices exchanged between the beast women as they prepared for the day ahead. He sat up slowly, his eyes searching for the lioness. She was standing a few feet away, her posture relaxed but her gaze sharp as she watched the perimeter of the camp. Her golden fur shimmered faintly in the sunlight, and her tail swayed slowly behind her. When she noticed him stirring, she turned, her expression softening. "You're awake," she said, her voice calm but tinged with something he couldn't quite place. Relief, perhaps. "We'll need to move soon. The pack cannot stay in one place for long." Alistair nodded, brushing a hand over his face to clear the last remnants of sleep. "I understand," he said. "But what now? What's the next step?" The lioness walked over to him, her movements fluid and silent. She crouched beside him, her amber eyes meeting his. "We continue what we started," she said quietly. "The process we began last night. It will take time. The energy we awakened needs to settle, to grow stronger. But it won't mean anything if we can't protect ourselves." Her words brought a knot of tension to Alistair's chest. He had felt the magnitude of what they had begun, the weight of the magic that had surged through him. But now, the reality of their precarious situation was sinking in. This wasn't just about ancient rituals or magical slabs. It was about survival. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the unease bubbling beneath the surface. The lioness studied him for a moment before standing and offering him a hand. "You've already done more than we could have hoped," she said. "But there's more to come. We'll need your strength, your guidance." Alistair took her hand, letting her help him to his feet. Her grip was firm, her touch warm. As he stood, he noticed the other women watching them from the edges of the camp. Their gazes were cautious but filled with a quiet respect. He couldn't tell if it was because of what he had done or what they expected him to do next. The group began packing up the camp, their movements efficient and coordinated. Alistair helped where he could, though he often felt out of place among them. These women were strong, their bodies built for survival in a way that his wasn't. And yet, he had become an integral part of their plans, a piece of their survival puzzle. As they moved deeper into the forest, Alistair found himself walking beside the lioness. She seemed to sense his unease, her tail occasionally brushing against his leg as if to reassure him. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them felt comfortable, a shared understanding forming in the quiet moments. After a few hours of trekking, the group reached a secluded clearing surrounded by towering trees. The air here felt different, heavier, more charged. The lioness gestured for the group to stop and began giving quiet instructions to the others. They moved with purpose, setting up a temporary camp and scouting the area for threats. Alistair watched them work, feeling a strange sense of admiration for their resilience. These women had been through so much, yet they continued to fight, to adapt. He couldn't help but wonder what their lives had been like before things had fallen apart, before desperation had driven them to seek him out. The lioness approached him again, her expression thoughtful. "There's something I need to show you," she said, her voice low. "Come with me." She led him away from the clearing, into a denser part of the forest. The trees grew closer together here, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air was cooler, the sounds of the forest muffled. Alistair felt a prickle of unease but trusted the lioness to guide him. After a short walk, They arrived at a small cave entrance hidden behind a cluster of rocks. The lioness ducked inside, motioning for him to follow. The cave was dark at first, but as they moved deeper, faintly glowing markings appeared on the walls, similar to those on the slab from the night before. "This place is sacred to my people," the lioness said, her voice reverent. "It's where we come to reflect, to seek guidance." Alistair ran his fingers over one of the glowing markings, feeling the faint warmth beneath his touch. "It's beautiful," he said softly. The lioness stepped closer, her presence grounding him. "I brought you here because I want you to understand what we're fighting for," she said. "Our traditions, our history, they're all tied to places like this. If we lose this, we lose everything." Her words carried a weight that Alistair couldn't ignore. He turned to face her, his gaze meeting hers. "I'll do whatever it takes to help," he said firmly. The lioness's expression softened, and for a moment, the tension between them seemed to melt away. She reached out, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "I know you will," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The air between them grew still, charged with an unspoken understanding. Alistair could feel the warmth of her touch, the steady rhythm of her breathing. He wasn't sure who moved first, but suddenly they were closer, her hands sliding up to rest on his shoulder. Her gaze lingered on his, her eyes searching for something. Before he could think, she leaned in, her lips brushing softly against his. The kiss was brief, almost hesitant, but it carried a depth of emotion that left him breathless. When she pulled back, her cheeks were tinged with a faint blush, her eyes avoiding his. "I shouldn't have," she began, but Alistair stopped her with a gentle touch to her hand. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice steady despite the rapid pounding of his heart. "I understand." The lioness looked at him, her expression a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "There's still so much to do," she said, her voice barely audible. Alistair nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Then let's do it," he said. Together, they stepped out of the cave, ready to face whatever came next. The forest was alive with the sound of movement, though most of it was cautious, deliberate. Alistair crouched behind a cluster of dense ferns, his ears straining to catch the faintest sound of their pursuers. Beside him, the lioness was tense, her tail still and her golden eyes scanning the shadows. The rest of the pack had spread out, forming a loose circle around the clearing where they'd planned to regroup. The plans had changed. "They're closer than I thought," the lioness whispered, her voice barely audible. Her hand rested on Alistair's shoulder, grounding him in the moment. "We need to move before they trap us." Alistair nodded, his mind racing. The pursuers, mercenaries most likely, hired by those who sought to exploit or eliminate the beast women, had been relentless. The group had been careful to cover their tracks, but it seemed their caution hadn't been enough. "We'll have to split up," he said, his voice low. "Draw them away from the main group. You can't risk the entire pack being caught." The lioness glanced at him, her expression conflicted. "You're suggesting you be the decoy?" she asked, her tone carrying an edge of disapproval. "That's not an option." Alistair gave a small, wry smile. "It's the best option," he said. "I can move fast enough to keep them distracted, and I've got a better chance of blending in if it comes to that." The lioness's jaw tightened, her tail flicking once in irritation. "You don't know what these people are capable of," she said. "If they catch you." "They won't," he interrupted, his tone firm. "But even if they do, you know what's at stake. You have to protect them." He gestured toward the direction where the rest of the pack was hiding. "I'm not saying this lightly, but we don't have time to argue." The lioness stared at him for a long moment, the intensity in her gaze making him hold his breath. Finally, she exhaled sharply and nodded. "Fine," she said, "but you're not doing this alone." Before Alistair could protest, she rose to her full height, her posture radiating determination. "I'll go with you," she said. "We'll split their forces. 2 targets are harder to track than 1. Alistair hesitated. He didn't like the idea of her putting herself in danger, but he could see that arguing with her would be futile. And truthfully, He felt a surge of relief at the thought of not facing this alone. "All right," he said finally. "Let's do it." The two of them moved quickly but quietly, weaving through the dense underbrush. The forest seemed to close in around them, the towering trees and tangled vines providing both cover and obstacles. Alistair's senses were on high alert, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves making his pulse quicken. The lioness stayed close, her movements graceful and silent. Despite the tension of the moment, Alistair couldn't help but admire her. There was something captivating about her strength, the way she carried herself with such confidence even in the face of danger. They reached a narrow ravine, its steep sides offering a natural barrier. The lioness gestured for Alistair to follow her along the edge, her sharp eyes scanning for signs of pursuit. They moved in silence, their breaths shallow, their focus unwavering. It wasn't long before the first sign of their pursuers appeared, a distant shout, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots crunching through the undergrowth. Alistair's stomach tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. The lioness glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "This is where we split," she said quietly. "I'll lead them west. You head east and keep moving until you're sure you've lost them." Alistair frowned. "Are you sure?" "Yes," she said firmly. "They'll chase me harder than they'll chase you. I can handle it." Her confidence was reassuring, but Alistair still felt a pang of worry as she turned to leave. Before she could go, he reached out and caught her arm. She paused, looking back at him in surprise. "Be careful," he said, his voice soft but earnest. The lioness's expression softened, and for a moment, the tension between them melted away. She placed her hand over his, her touch warm and grounding. "You too," she said. And then she was gone, disappearing into the shadows with a grace that made her seem almost otherworldly. Alistair watched her go, his chest tight with a mix of admiration and anxiety. He didn't linger long, though. Turning east, he began to make his way through the forest, his movements deliberate but swift. The next hour was a blur of motion and heightened senses. Alistair pushed himself harder than he had in years, his muscles burning as he navigated the uneven terrain. He wasn't sure how far he'd gone when he finally allowed himself to pause, crouching behind a fallen log to catch his breath. The forest was eerily quiet now, the distant sounds of pursuit fading into the background. Alistair strained his ears, but all he could hear was the rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. He hoped the lioness had managed to lead their pursuers away, but the thought of her out there alone made his chest ache. As he sat there, trying to steady his breathing, a faint sound caught his attention. A low growl, barely audible but unmistakable. His heart leapt into his throat, and he turned toward the source, his muscles tensing. Emerging from the shadows was not a pursuer, but the lioness herself. Her fur was slightly ruffled, and there was a small cut above her brow, but otherwise she seemed unharmed. Relief flooded through Alistair, and he stood quickly. "You're all right," he said, his voice laced with both surprise and gratitude. The lioness nodded, her expression weary but determined. "I lost them," she said. "For now." Alistair stepped closer, his gaze searching hers. "You're hurt," he said, reaching out to gently touch the cut above her brow. His fingers brushed against her fur, and she flinched slightly but didn't pull away. "It's nothing," she said, her voice soft. They stood like that for a moment, the tension between them shifting into something warmer, something unspoken. Alistair lowered his hand but didn't step back, his eyes lingering on hers. "We can't stay here," she said after a moment, her tone quiet but firm. "They'll regroup." Alistair nodded, though his chest felt tight. "Then let's keep moving," he said. Together, they turned and slipped back into the shadows of the forest, the weight of what they had faced, and what was still to come, hanging heavily between them. The air in the secluded glade was still, the soft hum of nocturnal life around them a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions inside Alistair. He sat on a smooth stone by the stream, his reflection shimmering faintly in the water's surface. The lioness sat across from him, her golden eyes fixed on the horizon, where the first streaks of dawn painted the sky. They had done it. Against all odds, they had evaded their pursuers, brought the pack to safety, and dismantled the operation threatening the survival of her kind. Yet, despite their victory, the weight of everything lingered heavily. "You've been quiet," Alistair said, breaking the silence. His voice was gentle, almost hesitant, as though he feared disturbing her thoughts. The lioness turned her gaze to him, her expression softer than he had ever seen it. "I've been thinking," she admitted, her tail curling lightly around her legs, "about what comes next." Alistair nodded. He understood the question beneath her words. They had faced their enemies and emerged victorious. But what did that mean for them, her, the pack, him? Their worlds were so different, their paths uncertain. "The pack will need time," she continued, her voice thoughtful. "Time to heal, to rebuild. But they're strong, stronger than they know." "And you?" Alistair asked, leaning forward slightly. "What do you need?" The lioness looked at him, her gaze searching. For a moment, she didn't answer, as though she was weighing her words carefully. "I need to believe this wasn't for nothing," she said finally. "That we've created a future worth fighting for." "You have," Alistair said firmly. "What you did for them, for us, it mattered." Her lips curved into a small smile, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "And you?" she asked, tilting her head. "What comes next for you, Alistair?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. The question was one he had been avoiding, unsure of the answer. His life before meeting her had been solitary, filled with routine and survival. But now he couldn't imagine returning to that emptiness. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I do know I can't just walk away from this. From you." The lioness's ears flicked, a subtle sign of her surprise. "You'd stay?" she asked, her tone tinged with disbelief. "Even after everything?" Alistair met her gaze, his expression earnest. "If you'll have me," he said simply. The lioness was silent for a long moment, her tail flicking thoughtfully. Then, without a word, she rose and crossed the small distance between them. Alistair watched her approach, his heart beating faster as she stopped in front of him. "You've already proven your strength," she said softly, her voice carrying an almost reverent tone. "But it's your heart that sets you apart." She reached out, her hand brushing against his cheek. The touch was light, tentative, but it sent a warmth through him that he couldn't ignore. Alistair raised his own hand, placing it over hers, holding her gaze. "I don't know what the future holds," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But if you're willing to face it together." "I am," he said, his words firm and unwavering. The space between them seemed to shrink as the lioness leaned closer, her golden eyes filled with something that took his breath away. Slowly, carefully, she pressed her forehead to his, a gesture both tender and intimate. In that moment, the world around them seemed to fade away. There was no danger, no uncertainty, only the connection between them, unspoken but deeply felt. The first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, casting a warm glow over the glade. The lioness pulled back slightly, her lips curving into a genuine smile. "Then let's face it," she said, her voice steady. "Together." Alistair smiled in return, a sense of peace washing over him. For the first time in what felt like years, he felt like he belonged. And as the two of them stood side by side, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew they had found something worth fighting for. Not just survival, but each other.